Thick November, air pressed against Lombard Street like a forewarning. Clerks walked faster, heads bent into the wind, as if speed alone could outrun a whisper that had turned into a rumor and was becoming a roar. In the big stone building, with the clock that has watched more panics than parish bells have rung weddings, the governor of the Bank of England, William Litterdale, sorted telegrams with the care of a surgeon and the dread of a parent. The message was simple and lethal. Barings, the Queen's banker, was running out of road. Barings Bank had been part of Britain's pulse since the reign of George III. Founded in the year 1762, it grew from a linen business into a merchant bank that advised monarchs, underwrote governments, and greased the axles of an empire whose trade routes looked like arteries on a maritime map. The house name carried a hush. This was the bank that kings phoned before they dared trouble their cabinets. It was called the Queen's Banker, not as a boast, but as a job description. By the late 1880s, the city's oxygen was international credit. Barings wore that oxygen like a crown. It underwrote government bonds, floated railway companies, and stitched together infrastructure loans that promised to turn frontier maps into ledgers. Investors in London could sit by their fireplaces and own a slice of a new world. And the best slice, everyone insisted, lay on the far side of the Atlantic, where Argentina shone like a fresh gold sovereign. Argentina in the 1880s was the story you told at dinner to make a dull guest stop talking. Buenos Aires was growing fast, the Pampas were a breadbasket, and British engineers were laying rails across distances that once belonged only to gauchos and dust. Newspapers called it the future United States of South America. The phrase did not sell hope, it sold leverage. Underwriting houses like Barings swallowed offerings in Argentine debt and railway securities, confident that appetite in London would do the rest. If a new issue did not find buyers at the desired price, the underwriter did not simply shrug. It held the inventory. Profits in that business depend on timing, and timing is a god that punishes arrogance. Concentration is a quiet kind of greed. It starts as focus, matures into conviction, and hardens into fragility. Barings took on too much Argentina. Loans to the government, loans to provinces, railway, concessions, utilities, the kind of paper that yields handsomely when growth compounds and becomes kindling when politics goes to the dogs. The partners told themselves they were not speculating. They were doing God's work for the bond market. The ledgers said otherwise. In the winter of 1889 and the summer of 1890, inflation in Argentina shredded confidence. The peso's credibility thinned. The Baring partners kept telling the story of rails and harvests. But the plot went sideways when President Miguel Juarez Selman faced a rising storm. The revolution of the park in Buenos Aires forced him out in August of 1890. Carlos Pellegrini took the chair. A sober man handed a spinning plate. Investors who had been eager to be modern suddenly wanted to be safe. They ran for the exits and found the doors narrower than memory. Credit collapses have a scent. It is the smell of paper becoming wood pulp again. Argentine bonds that Barings had underwritten sagged. Issues that had seemed as solid as granite lost their buyers. A merchant bank's capital in that era was both fortress and hostage, because the bank was a partnership with unlimited liability. There was no corral between the firm's balance sheet and the partners' estates. When a merchant bank slipped, its partners felt the cold of the Thames in their marrow. By November of 1890, Barings was facing liabilities of roughly £21 million, a sum that in today's money would wander into the billions. The firm could not roll the paper. London's money market, a skittish herd on the best of days, smelled fear. The city had seen this movie before in the collapse of Overend, Gurney and Company in 1866, and it knew how short the distance could be from a wobble to a stampede. The failure of Barings would not have been the fall of a single house. It would have been the flick of a match in a dry season. Here's the part where doctrine meets blood. Walter Bagehot, the editor who wrote Lombard Street in the year 1873, had told the Bank of England what to do in a panic: lend freely against good collateral, at a penalty rate. It is a mantra that sounds simple until the hour arrives. And the hour arrived with a telegram and a ledger that would not balance. Governor Litterdale moved. He convened the great houses of Lombard Street and Threadneedle Street and called in the men whose surnames could still quiet a room: Rothschild, Glynn, Hambro, Schroeder, and the rest. He did not ask them to like one another. He asked them to love their own survival. Out of that reluctant embrace came a guarantee fund of £17 million, subscribed by the leading banks and acceptance houses of London to backstop Baring's liabilities and prevent a forced liquidation that would have smashed credit glass across continents. You will sometimes hear that central banks merely press buttons and set rates. On that Sunday in November, the job looked more like trench work. Gold was the standard and the anchor, and anchors are heavy. To steady the pound and ensure the Bank of England could meet demand for gold, the Banque de France agreed to provide bullion. The Rothschilds, those masters of metal logistics, helped arrange shipments across a channel that had seen 1,000 wars, but now bore a peaceful armada of sovereigns. The message to the market was blunt. The Bank of England would meet claims. Confidence would not be allowed to die in public. Rescue is not absolution. The old partnership of Baring Brothers was wound down. A new limited company was formed to take over the viable business. The Baring family, led by Edward Charles Baring, Lord Revelstoke, saw their personal fortunes sacrificed to the altar of survival. The title Lord Revelstoke, by the way, had helped give a name to a Canadian town that still carries it, a reminder that the bank's reach had once stretched into the financing of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Prestige is a long bridge. It also conducts shocks. In Buenos Aires, the crisis did not read as polite minutes in a meeting. It felt like shuttered offices and unpaid invoices, and a winter with fewer fires. Argentina slid into recession, defaulted on parts of its debt, and found itself shut out of international capital for years. The future United States of South America returned, for a season, to the past tense. Decisions made in London, drawing rooms, had echo effects in the markets of Rosario and the streets of La Boca. That is the cruelty and the symmetry of global credit. What did London learn as the November dusk thickened into a night that did not quite become a funeral? First, that lender of last resort is not a phrase for textbooks. It is a function that must be exercised by humans with names who can pick up a pen and make calls that will make enemies. The Bank of England's action embodied Baghat's advice in spirit, if not in every letter. The guarantee fund was private capital corralled by a public institution. It worked not because the numbers were perfect, but because the signal was unmistakable. Second, that underwriting is not a ceremonial act. When a house writes its name beneath a bond issue, it is doing more than taking a fee. It is warehousing risk. In good times, that inventory turns quickly, and fees look like genius. In bad times, the warehouse becomes a museum of misplaced confidence. Barings had matched long-term Argentine exposures with short-term funding in London. Maturity transformation is a treacherous bridge when politics shakes the river. Third, that unlimited liability focuses the mind until it does not. Private partnerships can breed caution because partners know their houses are at stake. They can also breed overreach when the last crisis is far enough back to look like someone else's bad dream. The partners who signed off on the Argentine exposures did not expect a revolution to reach across the equator, any more than the partners of Overend Gurney expected the money market to turn to ash. The calendar does not honor our assumptions. The city's reputation did not shatter. It scuffed, then it steadied. British overseas investment slowed, then resumed. The habit of trusting London as the place where bills are accepted and disputes resolved survived the fright. Within a few years, the guarantee fund was wound down with limited losses. A small miracle stitched from many frayed threads. Barings itself survived as a reorganized house, leaner and humbler. But the old magic never fully returned. The aura of invincibility withers once it has been publicly disproved. There's an epilogue that feels like a ghost story, told in fluorescent light. A century later, in the year 1995, the same house died not of Argentine bonds, but of derivatives, trades booked and hidden in Singapore by a young man named Nick Leeson. He used an error account whose number read like superstition, concealed losses, and doubled down until the Kobe earthquake shook markets and finished the job his hubris had begun. The bank was sold to ING for £1. If you listen closely, you can hear history grin. Concentration risk and inadequate controls wear new clothes. Their faces do not change. From the perspective of an investor, the Baring crisis is not merely a Victorian melodrama. It is a guidebook written in expensive ink. Emerging markets can carry fortunes on their back, but every promise rides with two passengers named politics and liquidity. When either one jumps, the carriage tips. Diversification across countries is not cowardice. It is respect for the speed at which confidence migrates. When you read a prospectus for a new railway in a shining land, read twice the paragraphs about governance, currency, and the ability to repatriate returns. The yield on the coupon is the bait. The exit door is the lesson. Underwriting mechanics still matter today for anyone who buys into private placements, rights issues, or the debt of ambitious projects. Who stands behind the issue when rain falls instead of Sunday? What capital do they have at risk? How much of the issue can sit on their books without strangling them? If the answer sounds like a sermon about infinite appetite, you are listening to a fable conclude, not a balance sheet speak. Lender of last resort doctrine did not retire after 1890. It reappears again and again whenever trust seizes up. In the global financial crisis a century later, central banks lent freely against collateral that was good enough at rates designed to drain panic rather than fill it. Critics will argue about moral hazard until the end of credit. They are not wrong to worry. But only a well-run fire brigade can decide, in the heat, how much water to pour and how high to send the ladder. The key is to make the brigade both swift and temporary. There is a human angle that matters more than any bond coupon. The Baring partners who lost much of their personal wealth were not villains. They were professionals who let a narrative of growth bully their discipline. The officials who arranged the rescue were not saints. They were pragmatists who chose a messy survival over a tidy catastrophe. Markets are not machines, however often we reach for that metaphor. They are theaters where fear and hope pay in cash. The ripple effects of 1890 changed careers and reshaped institutions. Credit committees hardened their questions. Governments relearned the limits of cheerleading. The city's acceptance houses developed a new taste for contingency planning. Somewhere, in a clerk's notebook, a line was drawn that kept a future failure smaller than it might otherwise have been. We remember the headlines less than we remember the reflexes they taught. If you stand today on Lombard Street in the late afternoon, you can still feel the place where November once paused its breath. The taxi's thread passed and the phones glow. But the silence underneath is the same silence that held its posture while a bank, founded in the year 1762, threatened to come apart. The Bank of England's doors are still heavy. They remind you that money is paper without the weight of institutions behind it, and that the weight is a mosaic of decisions taken in bad hours by tired men who understand that the cost of delay is counted in livelihoods. The fall of Barings in 1890 was the day the Queen's banker went bust without quite dying. It was the day the modern lender of last resort proved itself in action. The day private capital was corralled for public stability. The day London learned that dominance is not the absence of mistakes, but the presence of remedies. It was also a warning, written in a script that repeats. Do not confuse optimism with collateral. Do not outsource risk management to reputation. Do not treat a frontier as a balance sheet without weather. For investors, the coda is practical. Diversify across stories, not just tickers. Respect the political cycle as much as the business cycle. Demand transparency about who holds the bag when the music stops. Remember that unlimited liability used to keep partners awake at night, and that limited liability has a way of letting people sleep through alarms. If the returns depend on everything going right in a country you visit only on a map, cut the exposure to a size that lets you breathe. When the Barings partners left their offices on those November evenings, they walked past gas lamps that shook in the wind. The light looked frail, but it did its job. So did the rescue. The city carried on. Argentina healed, then blossomed again, and stumbled again and returned, like all nations, to the long conversation between promise and discipline. The lesson you can put in your portfolio is the plainest one. In finance, prestige is not capital. Capital is capital. And the only thing more dangerous than a sure thing is a sure thing told by people who have never met a winter.